Peter Credlin, live on Sky News Australia.
Good evening and welcome to the show. I'm Caleb Bond. Well, let's take a look at tonight's top stories. Here's what's coming up on the program. We'll bring you the latest from Cairns as the clean-up from those devastating floods begins. Pro-Palestine protesters have gathered in the heart of Sydney, where the Prime Minister is making a speech right now. The energy grid in New South Wales is at risk of failing once again as hot weather leads to increased demand. And Northern Territory Chief Minister Natasha Fyles has resigned after she failed to disclose mining shares. We'll bring you the latest.
So for this reason, I believe the honourable course of action is to resign as Chief Minister.
Well, as the year draws to a close, the scene has been set for a much tighter political year in 2023. The past few months have been horrific for Anthony Albanese and the federal government. I mean, you've had the bungled release of criminal immigration detainees, and the government was clearly caught on the hop despite having known that the High Court's decision was a possibility since June. An asylum seeker boat reached Australian shores for the first time in years, a breach, of course, of Operation Sovereign Borders. Albanese went to China and came back basically empty-handed for, well, except this enlightening exchange with Xi Jinping.
President Xi relayed stories about his visits to Australia, including we had an exchange about, he spoke about the Tasmanian devils as being cute animals in Australia. I pointed out that whilst I like Tasmanian devils, they're probably not as cute as pandas.
People were saying that we have a handsome boy coming from Australia.
The mind boggles, eh? And the PM's policy baby, the voice to Parliament, of course, fell over in spectacular fashion. Now, I maintain that the loss of the voice wasn't a huge political loss for Albanese because no one really cared about it. The only issue on anyone's mind, according to all the polling, is cost of living and cost of living. The PM could have just moved on, chalked it up as a loss and got on with the job. But he's looked downtrodden ever since he was defeated, and in politics, perception is reality, which is perhaps why a news poll out today shows Australians rate opposition leader Peter Dutton as more experienced, more decisive and strong, and having a better understanding of the major issues than the Prime Minister. The government has lost bark since October. At quite a few points, it's looked as though Dutton was governing from the opposition. I mean, it was the opposition's amendments to the first bill to restrict the immigration detainees, which the government initially opposed and then accepted in full, that gave it any teeth. He's been stronger on anti-Semitism, stronger on immigration, which of course the government then adopted, and stronger on cost of living. Albanese, meanwhile, has provided really no practical assistance with the cost of living and has instead been swanning around the world, Airbus elbow, dancing it up in the Pacific. Dutton has come into his own as a leader. He's looking prime ministerial, and it's starting, obviously, thanks to this polling, to cut through. Now, we haven't had a one-term federal government since 1931, when the Scullin government, a Labor government, was defeated by Joseph Lyons. But it's not beyond the realms of possibility. Albanese's government only has the slimmest majority of 2 seats. 2 seats change hands and you're done. The next question, of course, would be who could form a minority government? Do the Greens go into coalition with Labor? Would the Teals, given they've been elected almost exclusively from old Liberal seats, side with Labor or the coalition? Things could certainly get very interesting, and it's not like we haven't been in this position in recent history. The Rudd-Gillard combo in 2010 wiped 11 seats off their landslide victory in 2007 and put themselves in minority government. So unless Albanese can dramatically change course in the new year, he ought to be worried. He appears weak and his cabinet appears even weaker. Incompetence is widespread. They've been strong-armed repeatedly by the opposition. Dutton has grown immensely as a leader. If Albo can't arrest the fall, nor will he be able to stop Dutton's rise. But this is my prediction. The Commonwealth Bank expects interest rates to start falling in September. As soon as interest rates and inflation begin to fall, the government will call an early election and campaign on a platform of, well, we've done the hard yards, we've got through the worst of it, and now we need your support to get the job done. That's exactly what Bob Hawke did in 1987 after a difficult 3 years in government. Now, Albanese is no Hawke, far from it, we know that, but the message was, let's stick together, let's see it through. And at that time, it worked.
We're on our way.
We're on the right track.
Australians have always been good at fighting back. With a little more strength and patience,
We'll see Australia right.
nothing worth having ever happens overnight. Together, let's stick together. Australians together, let's see it through.
Whatever happened to great political jingles, eh? All we get is negativity now. Well, let's go to the breaking news today. Of course, Northern Territory Chief Minister Natasha Fyles has resigned. Sky News Darwin Bureau Chief Matt Cunningham joins us now with the latest. This has all been a great mess. Why did she finally pull the pin?
Well, it was because of revelations about shares that she held in a mining company, South 32. Now, South 32 is the company that owns the Gemco manganese mine on Groote Island. And earlier this year, Natasha Fyles refused to investigate allegations of adverse health effects suffered by people on Groote Island as a consequence of that mine. Now, this followed an earlier revelation about a month or so ago that she held shares in the gas company Woodside. At the time of that revelation, Natasha Fyles said that she had BHP shares that were gifted to her by her grandmother when she was a child, that those shares had become Woodside shares when there'd been a merger of those two companies. And when she discovered that she had these shares, she had then decided to divest them. At that time, she said that she had been upfront and honest about all of her holdings, all of her declarations. She said she declared everything from the family home to her membership of the local sports club. So when it was subsequently revealed that Natasha Fyles had shares that she had not disclosed in this mining company, South 32, she really had no other option than to resign, and that's what she did this afternoon.
Found them down the back of the couch, I imagine. Now let's have a little listen to what Natasha Fyles said today.
It is clear that I have failed to meet the standards that are set for us and the standards that I set for myself, and I'm not going to make any excuses for that. So for this reason, I believe the honourable course of action is to resign as Chief Minister.
I mean, she says I'm not going to make any excuses, but she did spend about 5 minutes making excuses. I didn't intend to do it. It was all unintentional, but here we are today. I've got to do the right thing. Where did all of this begin? Where did these allegations or the knowledge that she had these shares come from?
Well, it was a report in the NT Independent, which is a news website that the Chief Minister and the Labor government have in fact banned from attending press conferences. So it was that news outlet that actually broke this story yesterday, ironically. I mean, there are many great ironies when it comes to Natasha Fyles resigning as Chief Minister because of her links to gas and mining companies. Natasha Fyles is probably the most anti-mining, the most anti-gas Chief Minister the Northern Territory has ever had. Former Labor Chief Ministers, including Claire Martin and Paul Henderson, have been all in for the gas industry. They went out and got a Japanese company, Impex, to come and build a giant gas plant in Darwin Harbour. And Natasha Fyles is the first Chief Minister we've had from the left faction, and she's really been lukewarm about the resources industry generally. In fact, just last week she was being asked about Santos's Barossa project and whether she wanted to see that project go ahead, a $5.8 billion project that's going to underpin the Northern Territory's economy for the next couple of decades, and she couldn't say that she wanted that to happen. So I think there's a fair deal of irony in the fact that she's now being forced to resign because she's being perceived as being too close to the gas and mining industry.
You're not telling me that hypocrisy exists in politics, are you, Matt? It's unheard of. Very quickly, we've got one hat in the ring now. How do we expect things to play out from here?
Oh, look, it will be an interesting next 48 hours. Natasha Fyles has said she'll officially resign on Thursday. So between now and then, there's going to be a lot of jockeying going on within the Labor Party as to who gets the top job. In fact, a lot of the cabinet have actually gone off on holidays and are frantically flying back to Darwin now, as the Labor caucus gets ready to cast its votes. That includes the Deputy Chief Minister, Nicole Mannison, who is still in Bali, I believe, or if she's not, she's certainly on her way back to Darwin now. She's put her hat in the ring. She's the only one who's publicly nominated for the position. Now, she belongs to the right faction. The right faction would be smarting about the fact that they lost the Chief Ministership for the first time last year when Natasha Fyles took over. But I don't think the left will give it up without a fight. I'd expect either Joel Bowden or Chancey Paik from the left faction to put their names forward and to contest this. The caucus, the 14 members of the caucus, are split fairly evenly, Caleb. There's 7 left. There's 6 left, there's 6 right, and there's 2 who are unaligned. So I think there's going to be a lot of promises made over the next couple of days. It'll be interesting to see who lands the top job come Thursday.
Well, at least it's a short trip from Bali to Darwin. Matt Cunningham, thanks for your time tonight, mate. All right, let's head now to Cairns, where the clean-up after those devastating floods is underway. Joining me is Sky News reporter Rhiannon Elston. She's at Holloways Beach in Cairns. What's the latest?
Yeah, people have been telling us they had little to no warning before the deluge hit on a Sunday morning. Now, all afternoon here at Holloways Beach, north of Cairns, we've seen a coordinated effort between police, the SES and surf lifesavers who've been ferrying people across this body of water that didn't exist until just a couple of days ago. Now, such was the force of the water, it actually broke a new path here out to the ocean, absolutely destroying that road you can see here behind me. Now, on the other side of this divide, 50 homes where there's really no other way in or out. So people have been stranded there for as much as 48 hours. And what we're hearing is that they were running low on essential supplies, things like food, drinking water, and living off electricity. Some very relieved faces as they were rescued today.
Well, you'd have to say they've done extraordinarily well under the circumstances. I mean, you would have thought, given, as you said, they had very little warning that this was coming, things could have gone a hell of a lot worse, but they seem to have come out, apart from, of course, loss of homes and assets, etc., reasonably unscathed.
People in this community are really devastated, but what we have seen today are mates helping mates, chipping in, cleaning up. But there's really very much an ongoing emergency situation here. People have lost everything. They've lost all of their possessions. Some have told us that they'll have to move. And further to the north, we also saw police coordinating with the Australian Defence Force to rescue people with helicopters off the roofs of those communities in Wujal. That's one of the hardest hit regions. So still a clean-up effort here and still quite a lot of answers to be had about what exactly happened here on Sunday.
Yeah, well, 2 metres of rain, as we've been talking about 7 foot in old money, is quite extraordinary. The clean-up, obviously, as you say, is underway now. What's the process looking like for the next week or so leading into Christmas?
Yeah, there's plenty more to be done here. We've seen multiple agencies out in force, from the Defence Force, the SES, the police, surf lifesavers. Everybody is coming together to do what they can. But you just need to look at this gaping hole behind me to see what the level of cleanup is going to be. It's going to take weeks, if not months. I think it's going to be a very difficult Christmas for many.
Rhiannon, thank you for your time. Well, let's head now to Mark Olsen, the CEO of Tourism Tropical North Queensland. The Prime Minister has announced disaster relief payments for individuals as well as businesses. Do you think it'll be enough?
Oh, we know that there's quite a few more stages left in this process, Caleb, so thank you so much for giving us a chance to tell our bit of the story. The tourism industry here in the region has been really supporting those affected communities. We're providing emergency housing, we're providing support to the emergency services, and now running a ferry service between Cairns and Port Douglas. So this whole situation is still really unfolding, probably another 24 to 48 hours until we really know exactly what's going on. The federal government has been leaning in, the state government has started leaning in, but we know there's still quite a few steps to go in terms of the support packages for industry, for the community, and to get this region back up to its best.
Oh, well, what sort of cost is this to your industry? I mean, particularly this time of year, it's summer, lots of people would have been planning to or had planned to go up to far north Queensland, places like Cairns, and get away for Christmas. Now, many people might be reconsidering that, and we'll get to that in a minute. But how much of an impact, immediate impact, has this had on the tourism industry?
Yeah, Caleb, remembering we had 7 days of warning coming into Tropical Cyclone Jasper, who then spent 3 days sitting over Cape York, dropping, as you said, well in excess of a metre of rain, record levels of rain coming into one of the wettest parts of Australia. So over this last 7 days, we've seen close to $125 million worth of forward bookings that would have and had already been made disappear off the books. So the industry is certainly finding it very tough at the moment. It's wiped about 10% off the forward book for January. Over the last couple of days, our focus has been on supporting our community, but today it really needs to start to turn to making sure that those visitors who have got bookings are holding on to them while we can really get a grasp on what's coming back. And today we already started some part of that recovery. Our reef operators went out today and found the Great Barrier Reef in really great condition, which we were a little bit worried about with the cyclone crossing it. And tomorrow we'll see products like our Skyrail and our wildlife attractions all back into full operation. So it's been quite the impact. We're hoping that we can get that back on board because that's about 20% of what we would normally see in visitor expenditure over the months of December and January. That's been wiped away.
Well, if someone's sitting at home tonight saying, well, you know, I had a holiday planned or I was thinking of going up there, and they're looking at it now and going, well, I don't know, what would be your message to them?
Yeah, well, the airport is open. We're accepting flights again. The accommodation have done an incredible job of providing great experiences. Locations like Mission Beach are really good to go. So blue sky down there today, and we start to see the sun really come back. So new properties like Alandra, the reef operators are running out of Mission Beach. We started running our reef fleet from Cairns today. As I said, the Skyrail is back on board. Products like our aquarium, our wildlife attractions never stop because they've got to continue looking after those incredible creatures. They've been running. All I would do is say to you, if you do have a booking, contact your accommodation provider, come onto our website, Cairns and the Great Barrier Reef, and see the experiences that are already up and going again. And over the next couple of days, more products are becoming back in. So reach out, let us know what your plans are. We do have a disconnect at the moment. We haven't yet got the connection back between Cairns and Port Douglas, but we can get you to Palm Cove. And we do have a ferry service running between Cairns and Port Douglas for the next couple of days, hoping that we can get those roads reconnected. But you can see that it is going to take us a little while to get our heads around just some of those road connections that have been broken over the last 3 days.
Well, if there's anything we can do in this country, it's get behind each other, and that's exactly what we should be doing right now. If you're thinking of taking a holiday, even if you hadn't thought about going up to far north Queensland, put it in your diary, get it done, support the businesses who are doing it hard right now. Mark Olsen, thank you so much for your time. Well, let's talk now about New South Wales and hot weather, because it's once again putting staggering demand on the energy grid. Now, the energy market operator, the AEMO, had originally issued a warning for today, but revoked that given temperatures were not quite as hot as predicted. But this is only the start of what's meant to be a hot, dry summer, and there are plenty of hot days ahead. And we know only last week we had the New South Wales Energy Minister telling people to turn up the thermostats on their air conditioners to avoid overloading the system. But this, as we know, is all because of this blind pursuit of renewable energy and the degradation of our coal power assets that has led us to this. And we have all this uranium in Australia, about a third of the world's deposits, and we still refuse to entertain nuclear energy. Well, joining me now is nuclear expert and engineer Dr. Adi Patterson. Dr. Patterson, welcome to the program. You were the Chief Executive of the Australian Nuclear Science and Technology Organisation, which is a government organisation, so you know and are aware of how all this stuff works at the highest level of government. You've written to the Prime Minister urging him to lift the ban on nuclear energy and make it part of our system. Have you received any response?
I have not received a response as yet. Last time I wrote to the Prime Minister, I didn't receive a response. So we are very concerned about the situation in the grid. We know that the wind blows 40% of the time, and so there is no way that you can turn 40% into 100%. The sun goes down at night. The objective of AEMO in their business plan is 100% penetration of intermittent renewables is the short-term strategic goal of the CEO of AEMO. It is not the cost of electricity. It is not the reliability of the grid. It is not how you and I feel about the prices we experience. And so this is an organisation that has bolted itself onto an impossible mission that does not obey the laws of physics and doesn't obey the principles of engineering.
Well, I mean, there's two problems here, right? One is the cost, which you and I pay for when we get our power bills, and if they put up these 10,000 kilometres of power lines that they say they need to make this renewable green dream work, well, again, you and I pay for that eventually. It comes through our bills. Someone has to invest the money up front to build it, but they want to get a return on investment. So that return on investment comes from us. So there's cost is one thing, but as you say, if you're saying we want 100% renewable penetration into the system, where are you going to get 100% renewable energy from without some other kind of backup or some other kind of baseload power sitting there, which at the moment is coal, but they keep driving out of the system?
I think it's almost impossible to imagine the future that they've constructed. I worked on batteries in the 1990s, sold patents for batteries, lithium batteries, to Japan. So with my battery background, I am at a loss to understand how we will get more than minutes to hours ever out of batteries in future. That seems to be part of the narrative at the moment. It's simply impossible. So we're sitting with a situation where instead of finding a way to deal with the reliability challenge, we're going to build a big new grid. Now, the Eastern grid in Australia is already the most complex machine in the Southern Hemisphere. It's got about 10,000 kilometres of grid. We are going to double its size, but reduce the number of electrons that each pole and wire carries. This is a recipe for disaster. And I don't want to oversimplify it, but it is that simple. Last Thursday, we saw people in regional and rural New South Wales, before they built that grid, having blackouts on a random basis because of the temperature and because of the instability of the grid. But it's worse than that, because the quality of electrons, that 50 hertz signal, when it becomes distorted by too much wind and solar, it damages precision equipment. You cannot manufacture, for instance, in South Australia, jobs have been lost because precision manufacturing, in the place we were intending to build our submarines, cannot be maintained with the quality of electrons in South Australia. We've got more than just a short-term problem. We've got a systemic planning problem and a structure that reinforces the egos of people who have a goal to do something with renewables, as opposed to a goal of providing clean, reliable, always-on, low-cost electrons to the people of Australia. I would love to see AEMO with a goal that talks about consumers of electricity and talks about quality of service.
Got to imagine thinking about the consumer instead of whatever commercial objective you've got in front of you. And this is obviously where nuclear comes into it, right? We've had this moratorium since the 90s because the federal government consolidated all the laws from around the states. Victoria had a ban. Part of the agreement was that the ban went national. I have said ad nauseum here on Sky and elsewhere in the newspapers that if the federal government truly believes that nuclear energy is not economically viable, then they have nothing to lose in lifting the moratorium, because no one will build it. But I suspect what they're actually worried about is that it will be economically viable, someone will invest in it, they will build it, and this great renewable dream of theirs will have a whole shot in it. And the years, the decades of money and policy that have been expended on this will look silly. And I think it was the Queensland Energy Minister made exactly this point in an address to a renewables conference a couple of months ago, where he said to them directly that nuclear energy would be a moratorium on your industry. It seems plain and simple.
I think it's right. I think, first of all, bans are not really good in democracies. To ban something that many of our partners, including the US and the UK, who are going to build nuclear submarines with us, they have just, in fact, in the US, they've just made it much easier to build nuclear power again. So we've got a partnership in defence that is positive about nuclear. And we've got a propensity, I think, in our environment to think that we can be different to the rest of the world. But when it comes to electrons, there are no lucky countries. There are countries that have long-term plans, they put the infrastructure in place and they build it strategically. Today, in nearly every modern nation, and there are 40 new-to-nuclear nations around the world, the queue is forming to build the next generation of nuclear. It's safe, it's reliable, it's versatile, it can live with renewables. And so it's not a war against renewables, it's a partnership with renewables. It's the appropriate partnership. Now, that appropriate partnership has been achieved in places like France, for example. It was not achieved in Germany, where they shut down 26 nuclear power plants and reopened brown coal plants. So we know already what that experiment looks like. Trying to do something that engineering doesn't allow you to do will lead to the worst of consequences.
And I mean, you know, we find ourselves in this situation, as we talked about before, where, you know, we've had warnings that we could run out of power on hot days. Here we are in well, you might call us a third world country, if that's the sort of situation we're getting to. And without something like without something like nuclear in the system, with renewables operating as they are at the moment, going towards this 100% goal, surely they can see what's going to happen.
I think it's even worse than you say, because we know that in the 2 weeks before Christmas, we very seldom stress the grid. So to me, it is remarkable that at this period of the year, when we would expect to have everybody kind of relaxing and moving towards Christmas, we've seen a unique event where people in New South Wales have failed to have electrons. The real challenge, I think, is for AEMO to immediately stop trying to achieve a renewables goal and get back to electrons for everybody goal.
Well, we'll see how things transpire. I'm not hopeful, but we've got to keep the work up. Dr. Adi Patterson, thank you so much for your time. Well, good news for Peter Dutton. Voters have scored him higher than Anthony Albanese, as I said earlier, but will Labor's internal divisions be the end of the Labor government? More after this. Well, there's no shortage of news around today. You wouldn't know it was the week before Christmas, would you? Joining me to get through it all is Liberal MP Garth Hamilton and former New South Wales Labor Treasurer Michael Costa. Gentlemen, good evening. Michael, I'll start with you. You're a Labor man. What did you make of the resignation of the NT Chief Minister Natasha Fyles today?
Well, I thought there was no choice but for her to go. But look, the whole thing was very sloppy, given the sorts of amounts of money that are likely to be attached to those shares. I thought it was a ridiculous position for her to put herself in, particularly given the fact that she had an incident, I think, about 4 weeks ago with another bundle of shares. So it was really sloppy, amateurish, and at the end of the day, I think she had no choice but to go.
Yep. Well, I mean, you know, you'd think you'd know what shares you had, and after the first time around, you'd do something about it. But anyway, stupidity in politics, who knew? Now, Garth, to you, good news for your leader, Peter Dutton, today. This latest news poll has put him ahead of Anthony Albanese on a number of fronts. Dutton is regarded as more experienced, he's stronger, he's a more decisive leader than Anthony Albanese, but it does still say that he's less likeable and trusted. I think this gives some hope to the opposition, does it not, that as a leader, Dutton this year, particularly in the last few months, has really propelled himself to the fore in the face of some great weakness from the federal government and Anthony Albanese.
Well, look, it's great to see Australia get to know the Peter Dutton that I know and the strong leader that he is. And certainly 2023 has provided lots of challenges for both him and the Prime Minister. And I think very clearly Peter's done very well. But look, polling comes and goes. I think the real question will be at the next election when people will be asking themselves, are we better off under this Labor government, who have not pursued policies that are addressing the needs of the average Australian out there and have had a zealotry about the way they've gone about their business, not listening to Australians, be it on The Voice or other issues. I think the comparison is going to get worse and worse as the economy continues to look quite bad, particularly for young people trying to save money to get on the housing.
Yeah, and this is why I said earlier in the show, I suspect as soon as interest rates start coming down and inflation starts going down, the government is going to start looking at another election, because you may as well get going while the rubber's hitting the road. Now, I want to get both of your thoughts on what's happening in Sydney right now. We've got these pro-Palestinian supporters who've descended on Sydney's town hall, where the Prime Minister is giving a key speech. I mean, Michael, these protesters, you know, they're calling for all the usual stuff, a permanent ceasefire, an immediate end to the siege and occupation, as they say, of Gaza and the West Bank. They want Penny Wong to cancel her visit to Israel next year. Wasn't it only last week, Michael, that we, along with New Zealand and Canada, basically called for a ceasefire?
Well, that's true, and I think it was the wrong decision, as I said previously on Sky. I think it was a very foolish position for the Australian government to take, and you can see from that demonstration. Look at the placards. You know, Palestine has a right to defend itself was one that I just saw there, which seems to imply that you know, Hamas was justified in what it was doing, which is just absurd. Look, I think Labor's got a real problem on this, and part of it's got to do with its own internal politics. The branches in Western Sydney that are putting pressure on MPs. But more broadly, in a strategic sense, it's got to do with the sort of rise of the left in the Labor Party and the decline, particularly of the New South Wales right, which always provided a sort of countervailing force to some of these nutty positions, which have always been around. They've been around for decades in terms of the left of the Labor Party. What I find extraordinary about this is I heard a Labor minister today trying to draw some sort of moral equivalence between Islamophobia and anti-Semitism in the context of what's going on, which is absolute nonsense. I mean, you know, the ignorance of these people is, and by the way, I support people's right to protest, ignorant or not. They're entitled to show their ignorance as long as they don't call for genocide. Yes. But when you get Labor ministers sort of, you know, trying to draw this moral equivalence between the two phenomena, it's really disturbing. I mean, there are over 400 mosques in Israel. Anybody who's been to Israel knows that there is a active, practicing, supported Islamic community in Israel. You can't say the same thing about, you know, the Jewish communities in the Arab states that surround it. It's just a nonsense to draw an equivalence between Islamophobia and anti-Semitism in this context. Of course, we're opposed to Islamophobia, but this is not what this is about. This is about Israel's right to exist, and let's not try and, you know, hide it or confuse the issue. That's what it's about. And these protests just show people's ignorance.
Well, you're certainly not going to find 400 synagogues in the middle of the Gaza Strip. And this has been part of the problem here, Garth, as Michael says. Labor's sort of talked out of both sides of its mouth on this. There are deep divisions within the party about its response to Israel and Gaza. You've had dozens of high-profile Labor figures, including members of the Albanese government, who've now broken ranks and accused Israel of violating the human rights of Palestinians, and they've accused Israel of policies aimed at the domination of one people over another. I mean, if they can't get their message straight, if the government can't get its message straight, then A, it's no surprise protesters would be hitting something like the PM today, because he doesn't even know what he's saying on this. But it really risks our position as an ally of Israel and an ally of the West when we can't decide, the government can't decide whether it supports a democracy or a terrorist organisation.
This could not be a more sick perversion of the truth. Now, Israel has a long and proud history of seeking a two-state solution. That's Israel's legacy. That's what it has sought. Hamas seeks the destruction of Israel from the river to the sea. And to suggest that there's some kind of equivalence there is absolutely extraordinary. We need to be very, very clear on where we stand as a nation, as a Western democracy, standing up for those who do seek freedom, those who do want to see the embrace of democracy spread further and further around the world, and to stand up against terrorism. And goodness me, you would think this is a very, very simple position for us to take. But look, I go back to that UN resolution and point out once again, this is a resolution that not only did it not condemn Hamas didn't even mention Hamas. It was the weakest possible weasel way out, the worst fence sitting you could possibly undertake. And it is no surprise, sadly, that this Albanese government has taken that position.
Now, Michael, we've got a minute left, but I just want you to put your Treasurer hat on, because there's a new survey has found 60% of Australians believe the economy is either in recession or will tip into one next year. What do you make of that?
Look, I think it's unlikely, and the reason I say that is not to diminish the pain that people are suffering. Anybody that's got a mortgage in the current environment is certainly under stress, and certainly they would be feeling like there's more than a recession on, a very extreme recession if you're a mortgage holder. However, those migration numbers are precisely aimed at keeping the GDP numbers high, and what you're going to find is if you bring in, 700,000 people over a couple of years, they're going to spend money on goods and services, and the way GDP is measured, that feeds right into it. So I don't see a technical recession coming about, but that doesn't diminish the pain that people are suffering at the moment.
Indeed. Gentlemen, Garth Hamilton, Michael Costa, Merry Christmas to you both. We'll see you next year. Well, after the break, Australia is set to deny a request by the US to send a warship to the Middle East. Does this risk our relationship with our closest ally? More on that after this. Welcome back. Well, Australia's defence officials have been talking with their US counterparts today in the hopes that the United States want an Australian warship for the operation in the Red Sea to be changed. Now, a tweaked request might offer political relief for the government because they were facing pressure over their hesitation to answer the appeal for a ship, and the suggestion now is that we'd send more Defence Force personnel instead. But the fact is, the only reason the US is looking to modify its request is because Albanese refused to send them a ship. I'm joined now by Strategic Analysis Australia's Marcus Hellier. Marcus, welcome. Why has Albanese been so reticent to send a ship to the Red Sea?
Well, I think it's basically because we don't have many ships available. I think we've sort of reached the point where the failure of the previous government's naval shipbuilding program has culminated. And the fact is we only have 3 modern warships. We have 8 older ships, but they're quite small. They don't carry a lot of missiles. And in an environment like the Red Sea, where the Houthis are firing lots of missiles and lots of killer drones at Allied warships, those older Royal Australian Navy ships could be quite vulnerable. So we don't actually, at the moment, have a lot of good options.
Let's just for a moment put aside the Red Sea, but what does it say about our defence capability that we either don't have enough boats or we don't have good enough boats to send over there right now? I mean, should we be worried ourselves about our own capability if something were to go down in our waters or waters closer to us?
I think we should be very worried. So we have 3 modern warships, the air warfare destroyers. They're pretty capable ships, but they're the only vessel that can really defend a task force or indeed an Australian city from missile attacks. So we want to keep them close to home. And the other issue is there's the so-called 3-for-1 rule with military capability, which says if you have 3 of anything, that means you can reliably deploy 1 of them. So from our 3 modern warships, we can probably reliably deploy 1. So I don't think it's a very good situation. And if we look into the future, the first new warship isn't scheduled to be delivered until around 2033, so that's a decade away. And the first AUKUS submarine, if we cross our fingers and hope really hard that delivers on time, we're still nearly a decade from getting the first nuclear submarine as well. So for the next decade, we're dependent on what we have already in the Navy, and that's already looking pretty thin.
I mean, where have our defence ministers been for the last decade or so? I mean, we've got a rising China, we know that. One of our closest allies calls us up and says, look, can we have a boat for 5 minutes? And we're like, no, we don't have anything. How do we get into this position?
Well, I mean, there's a lot of blame that can go around. We can point at the current government, but they essentially inherited a shipbuilding situation left by the previous government. We can point to some bad decisions made by senior officials in the Defence Department. There's been quite a few very interesting documents released recently that highlighted Defence's poor decision making. Excuse me. But the bottom line is we missed the opportunity 7 or 8 years ago to keep building air warfare destroyers. We built 3, they're good ships. We could have kept building them, yet we stopped and decided to build a completely new class of ship, the Hunter frigates, which are still a decade away. So, you know, the bottom line is the world out there doesn't really care that we've made bad decisions. It's not going to stop doing what it's doing. The Houthis don't care. They're going to keep doing what they're doing in the Red Sea. So we've wasted a decade or more, and now we're paying the price.
Maybe that was part of that conversation that Albanese had with Xi Jinping. He didn't come out with much else. So sorry, Mr. Xi, could you hold off for a few years while we build the ships? But just going back to the Red Sea, what does this mean for our relationship with the US? They've made what would on the face of it seem a pretty reasonable request. We're talking about one of the most important trade routes in the world. It's in our interest as much as it's in the interest of the US to defend that. We haven't been able to come through with what they've asked for. What kind of message does that send to our allies?
Well, it's not a good look, but, you know, Australia and the US have a very long relationship. Australian governments of both sides of politics have a long record of carefully negotiating with the US a sort of acceptable contribution that allows the US to say, we've got a coalition contribution from the Aussies. And, you know, we sort of specialise in deploying forces that are good enough to keep the Americans happy but won't cost us too much in terms of blood and treasure. And so I suspect in this case we'll find a face-saving compromise that will keep both sides happy. But will that actually put a real warship in the Red Sea, protecting trade and shooting down Houthi missiles and drones? No.
Just quickly, the suggestion is that what we would send instead is personnel. How many people might we send and what would they be doing?
Well, there's always lots of options. So one of the good things about Australia and the US's military relationship is we work very closely together. We understand each other. So Australian officers can plug quite quickly into US headquarters and take on responsible roles operating headquarters. So I'm sure the US will be happy to take 5, 10 or 20, whatever the number is, of Australian personnel and find useful work for them to do.
Marcus Hellier, thank you so much for your time. Merry Christmas. Well, after the break, convicted terrorist Ben Bricker is going to be released from prison this week. In fact, he is being released tonight with a court order giving extended supervision instead of locking him up again. But will it be enough? We talked about it last night. We'll get the latest next. Now, if you thought you were having a bad day, how would you like to be this bloke? Now, I don't mean Biden, he's always having a bad day, but that bloke you saw at the end was driving home drunk last night and crashed his car, wait for it, into President Joe Biden's motorcade. I mean, you can just see it. He jumps into his car, he's ripped, he's clinging onto the wheel, trying to avoid the attention of the coppers, and bang! He turns himself into one of the president's cars. Now, obviously, we don't want to make light of drink driving. It can lead to serious danger, but for heaven's sake, imagine finding yourself in that position. James Cooper, his name is. He's 46. He's been charged with drink driving under the influence and inattentive driving. If he wasn't already crapping his dacks driving drunk, I suspect he might have once he realised who he crashed into. Joining me now is Sky News contributor Kosha Garda and former Labor MP Michael Danby. Welcome to you both. Let's start with the release of convicted terrorist Abdul Nasser Ben Bricker. He's now been freed from prison, and the Victorian Supreme Court ruled today that he will be forced to comply with dozens of restrictions, including on who he can meet with and ankle monitors, all this sort of thing. But this supervision order has only been placed on for 1 year. 1 year! I mean, is that really enough for someone who plotted to blow up the MCG, the Crown Casino, Lucas Heights in Sydney? Is it enough for someone who only 3 years ago was deemed a serious risk to the community, which was a statement the courts agreed with? They locked him back up, but now 3 years on, all of a sudden he's apparently reformed. Here's what the Prime Minister had to say today.
It's not a matter of my view, it's a matter of the law. And we have put in place the strongest possible recommendations to ensure community safety, and it is a good thing that the courts have determined to do that.
What do you make of this, Kosha?
You know, it's hard to see how this makes sense, Caleb, and great to be with you as always. I think this is an example of where the legal framework and the laws as written just cannot keep pace with other government policies that are really reshaping the country, whether it's here or in other Western countries around the world, and specifically in this case, immigration. The quantum, the pace, the vetting that takes place of people who come here and get on that path to citizenship. These laws are not designed to be able to catch every single edge case, and that's kind of what happened here, where he fought that perspective that was out there stripping him of citizenship, won that in the High Court. And so, unfortunately, I think just within that framework, what the Prime Minister is saying is, from a technical perspective, there's nothing that the Commonwealth executive branch can really do. They're not vested with judicial powers to strip citizenship, and on that technicality, off he gets. What is the remedy here? It's going to have to be the legislators doing something to catch these edge cases. But the problem is they're always going to be behind the 8 ball when the upstream fire hose of immigration and poor vetting and all the downstream consequences that come from that are not remedied. There's only so much they're going to do, and unfortunately we're going to see cases like this, I think, again and again.
One of the things I worry about, Michael, is this bloke is being released into a world where we have heightened tensions between the West and Islamists because, of course, of this war going on in Israel and Gaza and coming home again. I mean, you've got these calls mounting for a Paran high school teacher in Melbourne to face disciplinary action after he praised Hamas at a pro-Palestine rally. Now, I'm not going to name the teacher, but this is what he had to say on Sunday.
Hamas is doing exactly what they have to do.
I'm sorry, Michael, but what?
Yes, what exactly? First of all, Merry Christmas, Caleb and Kosha. Most teachers are good people. I'm sure there's a correct procedure for examining this bloke, but I think he's going to spend the summer on Seek, which is, by the way, it'll drive you mad because it's a Jewish-owned company, or it was in the beginning. I don't think the TikTok generation has any knowledge of what's going on. Hamas is doing what it must. What, raping and torturing and mutilating people? You've got a very sound point about Ben Bricker. The court could have, under the law, given him up to 15 years of supervision. It does seem, for all of the vast expense and trouble that the government has gone to, for the court to only give them 1 year is strange.
Yeah, I agree. 1 year's not a lot of time for a bloke who, as we know, was going after major landmarks. I was talking to someone today who was at the MCG on the day where that bombing was planned to go down. And so you give him 1 year in a world where we're talking about fights between Islamists and the West. It just seems mad to me. Let's go to US politics now. We've found out who are these crazy people who continue to support Joe Biden. An analysis of the Federal Election Commission records has found the top 10 most expensive postcodes in the US were responsible for a large amount of Biden's donations. Approximately 81,000 people in just 10 postcodes have donated more than $7.5 million to Biden's campaign for a bloke who doesn't know how to speak kosher. I mean, it's amazing this great change we've had where the establishment and the rich now seem to support the Democrats as opposed to the Republicans, just as we've seen those changes in this country through the proliferation of the Teals, etc.
Very true. I think the rich supporting the left side of politics is one of the most fascinating, I guess is a word you could use, dynamics that we've seen in Western societies in the last 30, 40 years for many reasons. Biden is sort of just a front man at this point in time. Whoever it is, what they're really supporting is the left side of the aisle politically because the policies favor them, the system and the power structures are self-rewarding and reward them, and the culture approves of doing that. So it's kind of a win-win-win, I think, for people that live in those circles, and they don't have to live by often a lot of the policies that affect everybody else because they're in gated communities and in a rich standard of living. They're not affected by the economy, et cetera. And so in that sense, you can kind of understand why the trend is going in that way.
It's easy for them. I wish we had more time. Kosher Garden, Michael Danby, Merry Christmas to you both. Well, thank you for your company tonight. I'll be back tomorrow at 6 p.m. Up next is the Bolt Report with Steve Price.